Hello, and welcome, good friends, to another chapter in the endlessly swirling cosmic ballet that is What Happened. The dusty old tome that makes you question the frayed edges of your own sanity as you struggle to piece together the shattered memories of video games, both big and small, embarrassing and bold, finished and unfinished. So steel your nerves and hold to the last vestiges of your gallantry, because we're about to enter a world that was fraught with so many perils and setbacks that it should never have existed at all. There, was that good?
Okay, that's good.
Alright, so, when do I get paid?
You get it after you leave.
Are you fucking... Are you... Well, I guess I'm leaving then. Fucking bullshit, man. Fuck.
Yes, as the dulcet tones of Vati forewarned you, on this episode of What Happened we are taking a look at a particular video game that, by all rights, should never have even come out, let alone become such an enormous success that it spawned its own subgenre. This is, of course, the story of From Software's 2009 classic, Ninja Blade, which has since influenced pretty much every facet of game design, from difficulty to combat. Who am I kidding? It's Demon's Souls. In the mid-2000s, From Software was basically a non-entity on the worldwide video game stage. Yes, the Armored Core series was certainly a thing, but it was one of the many mech franchises that were stomping around at that time, unlike the zero that we have today. Unfortunately, much of FromSoft's other outputs, such as Kingsfield or Echo Knight, were unknown when it came to the mainstream, unless it had a bright red Agetec logo on the box. Smartly though, they were pretty frugal when it came to developing these niche titles, so they just needed to sell the bare minimum to keep the lights on. As the Xbox, GameCube, and PS2 were heating up, From Software decided to really start swinging for the fences to see what would stick, which is usually a strategy that never sticks. Horror games, JRPGs, card-based JRPGs, more mechs, action titles, Tenchu, and even some political commentary.
Michael!
If you can name it, they were attempting to make a game out of it. In 2005, however, the company was rocked by the sudden and aggressive appearance of a man named Hidetaka Miyazaki, who shook the company by the shoulders and shouted, "What are you doing?" and started directing all of their games, taking them from the bottom to the top in a whirling dervish of skyrocketing profits as money came raining down on top of their success boners. Which is, of course, a massive lie, as the real story is far more mundane. Miyazaki quit his job as an account manager at the tender age of 30 and suddenly decided to switch professions after he played Team Ico's Ico. While he had always been interested in gaming, this was the revelatory experience that spurred him to pursue a career in the industry. He interviewed, was hired, and quietly began work on Armored Core Last Raven as a planner, and excelled enough in the position that he was promoted to director on the next game in the mech series. This is where the protagonist and the antagonist of this story first appear, cause they're one and the same. As the industry was barreling towards the many closures and ballooning budgets of the 7th generation, Bethesda's Elder Scrolls series was rapidly gaining in popularity, especially the hype for its then forthcoming game Oblivion. Sony of Japan, wanting a piece of that first-person questing horse armor pie, contacted From Software and requested a title in the same vein, especially since the Xbox 360 would have exclusive console rights for a full year. Originally, the idea was to make a new entry in the Kingsfield series to be able to compete with Oblivion.
Oh wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Ludicrous idea at the time, but that was the initial plan. And it had been a hot minute since From Software had even touched a dark medieval fantasy title, with the last one being the Japan-exclusive Shadow Tower Abyss back in 2003 on the PS2. Now, just as this new project was starting to kick off, or kicked down in this case, Miyazaki was in the middle of directing his second Armored Core For Answer, when he first caught wind of this new fantasy project that had been greenlit elsewhere in the bowels of the FromSoft dungeons. It's been reported that he would regularly stalk the hallways of the company. "What's that smell?" is blood," and demanded to be put on the title. The realities of game development, though, came crashing down, as he was indeed too busy with Armored Core, and there wasn't really an opportunity to insert himself into this Elder Scrolls killer since it was going smoothly. That is, until it wasn't. Very quickly, the whole thing started to fall apart very a lot. FromSoft, a company that made Metal Wolf Chaos, was now tasked with making a massive first-person open-world RPG on brand new hardware, and that was bad enough. But when you consider that the hardware was the PS3, a console that even Sony struggled to get a handle on for the first few years, well, then things were bound to go off the rails. The team was struggling to make just about anything work, as just the prototyping phase languished for a year or two until it very nearly got cancelled when the original director was pulled off the project. And that's when Miyazaki saw his opportunity to strike. Demon's Souls was not going well. The project had issues, and the team had been unable to make a compelling prototype. But when I learned that it was a fantasy action role-playing game, I was thrilled. I realized if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could make it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care, as it was already considered a failure. One of his first ideas was to stop listening to Sony. The mandate that the project needed to compete with Oblivion was foolish even to the biggest of idiots, and since the project was viewed as the black sheep of the company, he took a risk and redesigned the whole thing, only keeping the medieval fantasy aesthetic, and this was due to Miyazaki being a huge turbo nerd. He was, and obviously still is, a fan of the swords and/or sorcery, and cites the Fighting Fantasy series of books as a huge inspiration. Among a massive list of sweeping changes was the switch to a completely different perspective, shifting it from first person, which FromSoft at least had some expertise in, what with King's Tower and Shadowfield, and opting for third person instead. So it couldn't be further from what Sony and FromSoft had originally agreed upon, like if they had tried, which they did try. Like, that's literally what Miyazaki was doing here. Personally, I didn't believe we could compete by taking the same approach as Oblivion, so I wanted to shift the focus on gameplay elements like combat and exploration. I had to do a lot to convince everyone that a third-person perspective was the best way to go. When you consider the environment design, the object and enemy placement, or the back-and-forth action of the combat, I knew we couldn't achieve our best unless the camera perspective was fixed. I shared a lot of stuff like that, and whatever came to my mind to try and convince them. Now, in certain episodes of What Happened, and when I say certain, I mean all of them, this is part of the story where the bosses, or the publisher, the money people, tell the game designer how very stupid they are, and to simply just do as they were told. But because Demon's Souls was in such a unique position, this kind of sad, neglected runt of the litter, these radical changes were almost always met with, yeah, okay, whatever, do what you want, we're going to cancel this later, we're just too busy to cancel it right now. Remember, FromSoft had a few other irons in the fire circa 2008, so Demon's Souls didn't really have a spotlight being shined on it. It was just off to the side, doing its, weird shit, and everyone was just happy to ignore it. Another good way to not get noticed is to just straight up lie to your bosses. Whenever they needed to give progress reports or presentations to Sony, Miyazaki and his team would just so happen to fail to mention certain aspects of Demon's Souls. What aspects specifically? Honestly, we didn't really mention the difficulty of the game when we did the presentations to Sony. We knew that certain members of the publisher would ask us to change it, so during the product concept presentation, I didn't talk about it much. Of course, I informed our direct producer at Sony, but he actually agreed with me. He thought that if we were too upfront about all the death about this new game concept, the marketing people would have run a mile. So that's why we had to be a bit sneaky about it. That's another thing about this dark little fantasy game that could. When it was speccing during this phase of its development, it must have put all of its experience points in the greatest attribute of all, luck. If the Sony producer who was working day to day with Miyazaki just so happened to not share this view about creating a high but satisfying level of difficulty, the whole Souls-like genre might not even be a thing today. Also, and some may not know this, the game's punishing nature was actually way more intense during this period, as their original intent was to have a permadeath system, whereupon once the player would eat shit, it would erase their save file from the PS3. The team eventually decided that this was going a bit too far.
This is wrong.
Aside from just the difficulty, Miyazaki crafted just about everything else that makes the Souls games. Interconnected maps, shortcuts, dropping your experience upon death, vague but enthralling lore, devious traps and devilish monsters, and even incorporated some themes from the company's older titles. Then, with nothing to lose, Demon's Souls had its first reveal and public showing at 2008's Tokyo Game Show, with the entire team, Miyazaki especially, now bursting with confidence in their unique vision. But just like struggling and fighting to get to the very top of the castle's battlements, only to be roasted, impaled, or crushed by an unexpected danger, the team was walking into a nasty surprise. Everybody hated it. Takeshi Kaji, the Sony producer, reflected on this sobering moment for the game. It was nothing short of a disaster. Players were initially excited about the concept of a dark fantasy game, but they were so critical of the gameplay. Many people presumed we were still iterating on the combat at that stage of development, despite it being nearly finished. The truth is that Demon's Souls is not well suited to previews, particularly at shows. You can't possibly understand its approach in 5 minutes. Because of the action RPG style, people simply expected it to handle in the same way as a Musou. When it didn't, they were left disappointed. This perception was aggravated by the fact that the controls aren't based on any familiar scheme. Only a handful of players finished the demo. Some even put the controller down at the character creation screen, which was particularly disheartening. This is, again, normally the time in our story where the game gets retooled, or a whole new team is brought in, or most commonly is just outright cancelled. Miyazaki was sure word would come down from Sony that the game needed to be fixed or changed or whatever. But in one of those many moments where fate was smiling upon them, it was a lucky coincidence that FromSoft had other projects that were also coming out at this time, so they were afforded some creative freedom. If Demon's Souls failed to sell, well, the slack would be made up by Ninja Blade, I guess. So the game finished up development unhindered and released in Japan exclusively for the PS3 on February 5th, 2009, selling approximately 345,000 copies in its first week, which I would be telling you if I were a notable super liar by the name of Patches.
I'm really sorry. I didn't mean what I said.
In reality, Demon's Souls wound up barely selling 20,000 copies in its first 7 days, and although both FromSoft and Sony top brass had no faith in the title, like zero, this was still dreadful even by their conservative estimates. So it's like, even by loser standards, Miyazaki's pet project was a massive, smelly loser, and his own outlook wasn't particularly good. During the period when we just completed development, the evaluation and sales forecast within From Software was not good, so I did not even imagine that it would be given another chance to develop a similar game again. Fortunately though, things got even worse. If you have the misfortune of your product underperforming in your home country, there's always the chance it might find success outside of it. The original No More Heroes had its famously horrific Japanese debut that was so bad it made Demon's Souls' failure look like a success. But in North America and Europe, it wound up selling several 100,000 copies and went on to see several sequels. So there was a hope that maybe it could be appreciated elsewhere. That was until Sony Worldwide President Shuhei Yoshida played the game and immediately crushed any hope for Sony to release it to the rest of the world. His reasoning was as follows. I played Demon's Souls when it was almost final. I spent around 2 hours playing it, and after all that time, I was still stuck at the beginning of the game. I told myself, this is crap. This is an unbelievably bad game, so I stopped and put it aside. Fortunately, however, this did not prevent other companies from publishing the game overseas, which is precisely what happened. Since the PS3 was one of the first major region-free consoles, various YouTubers and streamers imported FromSoft's latest and found a punishingly hard but immensely rewarding and mysterious adventure that, when compared to the glut of Waypoint and QTE-filled games that were flooding the market, was a breath of fresh air. Word of mouth started to spread about a niche Japanese game that dared you to try to play it, and balked at the idea of you ever beating it. Very quickly, there was enough groundswell that it spurred both Atlus and Namco Bandai to publish the game in both North America and Europe respectively. Sony's loss was their game. In a very stark contrast, Demons would go on to sell over 100,000 copies when it released that October, and while some reviews were still negative, everyone agreed it was something new and thus stood out far more than if it simply been a janky Japanese Elder Scrolls. As you can imagine, Sony regretted this decision. If they had kept this working relationship with FromSoft going and distributed Miyazaki's Baby outside Japan, the whole Souls series could have been exclusive to PlayStation consoles. Knowing they had something here, Namco immediately entered an agreement with FromSoft to publish the Dark Souls series, a name that is the best type of distinct, legally distinct. Sony still held the rights to Demon's Souls, you see, but Dark and Dark 2 seemingly released almost like back-to-back as things were moving so fast, with more fans, success, and profits soaring by the day. This is what pushed Sony to then seek out their own brand new franchise, which would take advantage of FromSoft's now sterling pedigree, and wanted Miyazaki to direct it. Hence, in 2015, the hunt commenced on the PS4.
Welcome home, good hunter.
I can only imagine the sheer amount of bowing, handshakes, and edible arrangements Sony had waiting for Miyazaki as an apology. Shuhei Yoshida himself has since admonished his lack of faith and foresight in the product. We underestimated the quality of Demon's Souls, and to be honest, the media in Japan did the same. We definitely dropped the ball from a publisher's perspective, including the studio management side. We were not able to grasp the value of the product we were making. Each subsequent FromSoft fantasy title, and I'm including Sekiro in there, has sold better than the last, so here in 2020 it was the perfect time for Sony to capitalize on the now often forgotten start of it all, with the Demon's Souls remake for the PS3 quintuple balling. And just like that, the loop is now closed. It was certainly a wild ride, filled with last-minute director swapping, multiple near cancellations, and extremely low sales, but in the end, Miyazaki's creativity and his rolling of the dice paid off incalculably for the company, of which he is now the president of, by the way. Demon's Souls went from its extremely humble beginnings as an Oblivion clone to having scores of its own clones and imitators. You could say that the success story of the whole Souls-like genre is the Demon's Souls of the video game industry. Oh, Jesus. If you know of any other long shots of the gaming industry where they were just but a hair away from disaster only to succeed in the end, leave a cryptic message in the comments below or open up a shortcut to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially nominate the subject of your choosing for our next episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.